My name is Adelaide Williams. I am 25 years old. On the day I graduated top of my law school class, my parents did not watch me cross the stage. They were across town attending my older brother Bradley's housewarming party for an apartment they paid for. I stood on the sidewalk outside the auditorium, the gold tassel of my valedictorian cap hitting my cheek, and listened to my father ask if we could reschedule my graduation dinner for sometime next month. What I did next, and who pulled up to that curb 15 minutes later, is the story of how I stopped begging for a seat at my family's table and bought the entire building instead. Before I reveal what happened when I handed my family the bill for their choices, take a moment to subscribe. You are watching Orange Vengeance. Tell me your age and where you are tuning in from down in the comments. Now let me take you to a concrete bench in Boston on a crisp Tuesday in May. Massachusetts runs on a very specific kind of currency. In Boston, academic prestige and legal lineage mean everything. Families reserve tables at private clubs years in advance for graduation day. Fathers hand down vintage fountain pens. Mothers host catered brunches. I sat alone on a concrete bench, clutching a leather folio that held my Juris Doctor degree. 3 years of grinding through 80-hour study weeks. 3 years of highlighting case law until the text blurred into gray streaks. 3 years of surviving on vending machine coffee and spite. I earned the highest grade point average in my class. I called my father the second I stepped out of the heavy oak doors of the hall. I assumed they were stuck in traffic on Storrow Drive. I assumed they were struggling to find parking. He answered on the 5th ring. The background noise bled through the speaker. I heard ice clinking against glass and a bass line thumping from a speaker. I heard my mother laughing in the distance. I asked him where they were. His tone carried the casual, breezy cadence of a man canceling a dentist appointment. He told me they were at Bradley's housewarming. Bradley had invited his new neighbors over to see the property, and my father explained that my brother got nervous playing host. They could not leave him hanging. My brother Bradley was 28. He had just founded a commercial real estate business, using a shell company bankrolled entirely by our parents' retirement savings. He bought one building. I just finished 3 years of grueling legal training. I reminded my father that my graduation had been on the calendar for 8 months. He sighed. He told me this was a critical step for Bradley's business. He said I was always the independent one and that I would understand. Then he asked if we could do dinner next month and promised to have my mother book a table. I whispered okay and hung up the phone. The weight of the diploma pressed against my knees. I watched groups of classmates hugging their parents, posing for photos, crying tears of relief. My chest felt hollow. A hot tear spilled over my lower lid. I wiped it away fast, angry at myself for the leak in my composure. A shadow fell over my bench. I looked up and saw Thomas. Thomas was the night janitor for the law library. He wore his standard gray canvas uniform with a ring of brass keys clipped to his belt. For 3 years, he was the man who silently emptied my trash bin at 2 in the morning while I outlined civil procedure. He watched me survive the crucible of this school. He leaned on his push broom and pointed out that I was wrinkling the parchment in my hands. My voice cracked when I spoke. I told him my parents went to my brother's housewarming instead. I did not try to hide the pain. Thomas operated on facts, and the fact was, my family abandoned me on the most important day of my life. He did not offer empty pity. He did not pat my shoulder or tell me they were proud deep down. He just studied my face, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver flip phone. He dialed a number from memory. He waited 3 seconds. "The smartest kid in this graduating class is sitting on a bench," he said into the receiver. "She is hungry. Hire her." He snapped the phone shut and slid it back into his pocket. He gave me a single nod, turned his cart, and pushed it toward the maintenance doors without another word. I sat there stunned, the cold wind biting through my thin graduation gown. I thought about packing up my things and taking the subway back to my cramped apartment. I thought about calling my mother to demand an explanation. But 15 minutes later, a sleek black town car glided to a stop at the curb right in front of my bench. The rear window rolled down. The tinted glass of the rear window lowered with a quiet hum. Inside the cabin, the scent of polished leather and cedar masked the city exhaust. A man in his late 50s sat in the back seat. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that projected quiet authority. He held a manila file in one hand and rested his other arm along the window frame. He did not look like a man who typically picked up strangers from the sidewalk. Thomas stepped forward and reached for the chrome door handle. He pulled the heavy door open and gestured toward the plush interior. I clutched my leather folio to my chest and stared at him. He gave me that same steady nod, the one he used every night when he locked the library doors. I gathered the folds of my graduation gown and slid into the back seat. The door closed with a solid thud, sealing out the noise of the traffic and the distant cheers of my celebrating classmates. The driver pulled away from the curb before I even had time to buckle my seatbelt. The man beside me placed his file on the center console. He extended a hand. He introduced himself as Jonathan Reed. The name landed like a gavel striking wood. Anyone who studied law in Massachusetts knew that name. Reed and Associates operated as one of the oldest and most prestigious white shoe firms in Boston. They handled high-stakes commercial litigation, representing banking conglomerates and international real estate developers. Their partners were legal royalty drawn exclusively from centuries-old family dynasties and elite academic circles. Securing an interview, there usually required 3 letters of recommendation from federal judges and a bloodline tracing back to the Mayflower. I shook his hand. His grip was firm and assessing. I asked him why the managing partner of Reed and Associates was picking me up outside a graduation ceremony. Jonathan Reed leaned back against the headrest. He explained that 26 years ago he was a first-year law student buckling under the crushing weight of his exams. He told me he used to hide in the basement archives of the library, convinced he was going to fail out and shame his family. He said a young night janitor found him having a panic attack at 3 in the morning. That janitor brought him a thermos of black coffee, unlocked a private study room, and told him to stop crying and start reading. Thomas was not a secret billionaire. He was not a hidden corporate investor. He was a man who spent 3 decades pushing a cart through the halls of an institution that produced governors, senators, and Supreme Court justices. He had seen generations of legal titans at their most vulnerable. He handed out paper towels, unlocked doors, and offered quiet encouragement to terrified students who later went on to run the city. Jonathan Reed looked out the window at the passing brick facades of Cambridge. He told me that when he finally graduated, he walked up to Thomas, shook his hand, and gave him a business card. He told the janitor that if he ever needed a favor, he had a blank check. For 2 decades, Thomas never called. Then 10 minutes ago, the phone on Jonathan Reed's desk rang. The managing partner turned his attention back to me. He said Thomas told him the brightest mind in the graduating class was sitting on a concrete bench crying and that she needed a job. He held out his hand and asked to see my folio. I handed over the leather binder. My hands shook slightly, but I forced my posture to remain rigid. I did not want charity. I had spent my entire life fighting for a seat at the table, and I refused to sit down out of pity. Jonathan Reed opened the folio. He pulled out my official transcript and my resume. The car was silent except for the soft hum of the tires against the pavement. He read every line. He noted the perfect grade point average. He saw the awards for moot court competitions. He saw the independent study on corporate liability clauses. He took his time processing the data with the cold, calculating efficiency of a man who built an empire on facts. He closed the folio and handed it back to me. His expression remained entirely neutral. He told me he did not run a charity. He explained that the legal world in Boston was brutal, fast, and unforgiving. He said he hired out of greed because he wanted the sharpest weapons in his arsenal to win cases for his clients. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked directly into my eyes. He asked if I was willing to work 80 hours a week. He asked if I could handle senior partners, tearing my briefs apart. He asked if I possessed the resilience to face opposing counsel who would use every dirty trick in the book to break my focus. I looked back at him without blinking. I told him I had just spent 3 years surviving on 4 hours of sleep a night. I told him I navigated an elite institution without a trust fund, without family connections, and without a safety net. I stated that I did not crack under pressure, because pressure was the only environment I had ever known. Jonathan Reed studied my face for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth twitched upward in a microscopic smile. He offered me a junior associate position effective the following Monday. He stated the starting salary. The number was higher than the combined retirement savings my parents had drained to fund my brother's business. It was a sum of money that immediately altered the trajectory of my life. It was not a gift. It was a transaction based purely on academic meritocracy. He was buying my brain and I was eager to sell it. I accepted the offer. We spent the rest of the ride discussing the specific division I would join. He assigned me to the commercial litigation wing. We arrived at my neighborhood in Somerville 20 minutes later. The luxury town car looked absurd parked in front of my crumbling apartment building. The driver opened my door. I stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk. Jonathan Reed rolled down the window one last time. He told me to buy a tailored suit over the weekend and to be at the office by 7 in the morning on Monday. The window rolled up and the car disappeared around the corner. I stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, breathing in the cool evening air. The personal abandonment I felt on that bench had evaporated, replaced by the fierce heat of professional initiation. I walked up the 3 flights of warped wooden stairs to my apartment. The hallway smelled of old carpets and boiled cabbage. I unlocked my door and stepped into the cramped studio I called home. I took off my valedictorian gown. I folded it carefully and draped it over the back of my desk chair. I placed the leather folio in the center of my small dining table, treating it with the reverence it deserved. I poured a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline. I was a lawyer. I was an associate at Reed & Associates. The world had just cracked wide open. A sharp buzz broke the silence. My cell phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. The screen lit up the dim room. I walked over and picked it up. A new text message from my mother sat in the notification tray. I opened the message. There was no congratulatory note. There was no apology for missing the ceremony. The text contained a simple demanding directive. She told me she needed me to pick up 3 large bags of ice and 2 cases of sparkling water for Bradley's housewarming party the next day. She ended the message by instructing me not to be late because they needed help setting up the patio chairs before the important guests arrived. I stared at the glowing screen. I had just secured a position at the most prestigious law firm in the state. I held a degree that proved my intellectual dominance. Yet to my family, I was merely the errand girl. They expected me to show up and serve drinks at a party, celebrating a brother who had never earned a thing in his life. I set the phone down next to my law degree. The real test was not over. It was only just beginning. I navigated my faded sedan through the manicured streets of Chestnut Hill the following afternoon. The neighborhood hummed with generational wealth. Ancient oak trees shaded the wide roads and wrought iron gates guarded sprawling properties. I parked 3 blocks away from Bradley's new address to avoid blocking the luxury vehicles lining the curb. I carried 3 heavy melting bags of ice and 2 cardboard cases of sparkling water up a sweeping cobblestone driveway. The house stood as a massive colonial structure projecting an image of undeniable success. Bradley waited on this front porch holding a craft beer. He wore a crisp linen shirt, expensive loafers, and a smile that he had clearly practiced in a mirror. My brother was 28 years old. 6 months prior, he decided he wanted to become a real estate mogul. Our parents promptly drained a significant portion of their retirement portfolios to seed his limited liability company. He purchased 1 single commercial property in a developing urban district. That singular transaction instantly earned him the title of entrepreneurial genius within our family dynamic. I walked up the steps and handed him the dripping bags of ice. He did not offer a word of thanks. He merely instructed me to dump the bags into the kitchen coolers, because his hired caterers were running behind schedule. I stepped through the heavy mahogany front door. The living room buzzed with the chatter of 50 guests. My parents circulated through the affluent crowd holding crystal champagne flutes. They introduced Bradley to new neighbors and distant relatives as a visionary businessman. My mother beamed with pride. She rested her hand on his shoulder, loudly narrating his fabricated rise to the top of the local commercial market. I stood near the dining room archway holding a plain glass of tap water, watching the performance unfold. A family friend named Susan spotted me from across the room. She navigated through the crowd, smiled warmly, and asked what I had been up to lately. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, my mother materialized beside us. Her smile tightened into a rigid line. She quickly told Susan that I was just finishing up some more school. She reduced a Juris Doctor degree from a top-tier institution to a casual, lingering hobby. She deployed the phrase, deliberately minimizing my achievement to ensure the spotlight remained permanently fixed on Bradley. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or attempt to correct the narrative. I took a slow sip of my water and observed the room. When you stop trying to force people to acknowledge your value, you start seeing their reality with sharp clarity. The facade in that house was incredibly thin. Bradley laughed a fraction too loud at jokes he did not understand. His eyes darted nervously around the room, tracking conversations rather than actually participating in them. He carried a frantic, restless energy that contradicted his relaxed linen attire. He looked like a man treading water in a storm, pretending he was merely enjoying a swim. I walked into the kitchen to refill my glass and escape the noise. A stack of mail sat on the marble center island, pushed haphazardly next to a silver tray of catered appetizers. The top 3 envelopes bore the official embossed seal of the Municipal Zoning Board. They remained unopened. Bright red final notice warnings peeked through the clear cellophane windows. Bradley was actively ignoring the city government. I stepped toward the walk-in pantry to grab a napkin. Through the cracked door, I heard hushed, urgent voices. My parents stood near the back patio entrance. My father rubbed his temples, his face pale. He told my mother they needed to liquidate their remaining index funds by Tuesday morning to cover Bradley's operating costs for the current quarter. My mother whispered back, her voice tight with panic. She reminded him the early withdrawal penalty fees would be steep. My father replied that they had no choice, insisting they had to protect the initial investment. They were financially bleeding themselves dry to sustain a hollow illusion. Bradley walked into the kitchen 10 minutes later. A sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He saw me standing near the marble island and pulled a folded document from his back pocket. He tossed the crumpled paper onto the counter right in front of me. He stated it was a simple vendor agreement for the commercial building renovations. He asked me to give it a quick read to ensure the language was standard. He added a patronizing comment noting, "I was good at reading boring school stuff." He wanted free legal labor from the sister whose graduation ceremony he had deemed too unimportant to attend. I picked up the document. I did not need to study the pages for hours. 3 years of brutal academic conditioning took over my brain. I scanned the text quickly, bypassing the standard boilerplate definitions, hunting directly for structural weak points. I found the fatal flaw on page 4. An indemnification clause sat buried in the middle of a dense, unformatted paragraph. The phrasing was highly predatory. The contract stated that Bradley's company assumed total financial liability for any structural damage caused during the renovation process. This language effectively shielded the outside contractors from their own gross negligence. If a pipe burst, or a load-bearing wall collapsed due to contractor error, the shell company would bear the entire cost. Because my parents acted as personal guarantors for his business loans, they would be held personally liable for the resulting bankruptcy. I tapped the paper with my index finger. I looked my brother in the eye and told him he could not sign this agreement. I explained the liability trap in plain factual terms. I warned him the vendor was attempting to transfer all operational risk directly onto his shoulders. My father walked into the kitchen, drawn away from the party by the serious tone of my voice. He asked what the problem was. I pointed to the specific paragraph and reiterated the legal danger. I explained the financial ruin that would follow a single contractor mistake. My father squinted at the paper. He did not bother to read the words. He looked at Bradley, then looked at me with a heavy, patronizing sigh. He told me I was being too academic. He said real business involved taking bold risks and trusting partners, not getting bogged down in theoretical legal jargon. He clapped Bradley on the back, assuring his son the contract was perfectly normal for the corporate world. He handed the document back to my brother, entirely dismissing the free legal protection I just offered. I watched Bradley fold the paper and slip it back into his pocket. He looked visibly relieved that our father had validated his ignorance. I realized in that exact moment that no amount of logic, no amount of protective warning could pierce their shared delusion. They preferred the comforting lie of his success over the harsh reality of my expertise. I placed my water glass in the stainless steel sink. I did not say goodbye to the guests. I did not seek out my mother for a farewell hug. I walked out the front door, leaving my family in the sprawling suburban home they could not actually afford. The engine of my faded sedan turned over on the first try. I drove back toward the city, the image of those unopened zoning notices burning vivid in my mind. The coming collapse was no longer a theoretical possibility, it was a mathematical certainty. I just needed to make sure I was standing far away when the foundation finally cracked open. The transition from the hollow suburban performance of my brother's housewarming to the cold granite lobby of Reed and Associates felt like stepping onto a different planet. The corporate law environment in Boston did not care about fabricated entrepreneurial genius or inherited potential. The partners on the 42nd floor only cared about billable hours, ironclad logic, and winning. I thrived in that ecosystem immediately. For the first time in my life, I operated in a space where the rules were clearly defined and emotional manipulation held zero currency. My new reality consisted of 80-hour work weeks. I arrived at the office before the sun crested over the Charles River and left long after the city streetlights flickered on. I practically lived in the firm's legal library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the quiet hum of the ventilation system. While other first-year associates complained about the grueling pace, I found it strangely peaceful. Exhaustion earned through genuine intellectual labor felt entirely different from the draining exhaustion of navigating my family's constant demands. Within my first 2 months, I built a reputation for possessing an unsettling level of meticulousness. Senior partners began requesting me for their due diligence teams. They quickly realized I possessed a distinct ability to locate the structural vulnerabilities hidden deep within complex commercial contracts. The same architectural reading skill I had tried to offer my brother for free was now billed out to corporate clients at $800 an hour. During a high-stakes merger negotiation in late August, I spotted a predatory indemnification clause buried in the appendix of a dense vendor agreement. It was nearly identical in structure to the fatal paragraph I had warned Bradley about at his party. I flagged the liability trap for the lead partner. He reviewed my notes, canceled the scheduled signing, and renegotiated the entire deal, saving our client millions of dollars in potential future damages. The lead partner did not pat me on the back or throw a party to celebrate my achievement. He simply nodded, assigned me 2 more cases, and approved my quarterly bonus. That was how respect was communicated in my new world. However, the ghost of my old world refused to stay quiet. As the leaves in the Boston public garden turned gold and the autumn air grew sharp, the background noise from my family began to escalate. Bradley's property management venture was beginning to experience the exact turbulence I had predicted. I started receiving sporadic demanding text messages from both him and my mother during my workday. At first, the requests arrived disguised as casual questions. Bradley would text me a poorly cropped photo of a lease agreement, asking how he could quickly evict a commercial tenant who complained about a leaking roof. A week later, my mother texted to ask if I could draft a formal cease and desist letter to a local plumbing contractor who was threatening to place a mechanic's lien on Bradley's building for unpaid invoices. They did not ask how my new job was going. They did not inquire about my well-being. They only reached out when they needed to extract free legal labor to patch the holes in a sinking ship. I ignored the casual texts. When the requests escalated into urgent demands, I realized silence was no longer sufficient. I needed to establish a rigid boundary. On a Tuesday morning in October, my phone vibrated on my desk. Bradley had sent an urgent message demanding I review a default notice from his primary lender. He insisted it would only take 10 minutes of my time. I picked up my phone and typed a very clear professional response. I informed him that my employment contract with Reed and Associates contained strict conflict of interest policies. I explained that providing unbilled off-the-record legal counsel to a family member's commercial entity constituted a severe ethical violation that could jeopardize my license to practice law. I stated that I was prohibited from reviewing any of his financial or legal documents. I hit send and placed the phone face down on my desk. The retaliation arrived exactly 4 hours later. My phone lit up with a voicemail notification from my mother. I waited until I finished drafting a summary judgment motion before I put on my headphones and pressed play. Her voice filled my ears, dripping with a toxic mixture of victimhood and venom. She did not sound like a mother speaking to her daughter. She sounded like a cornered debtor lashing out at a bank teller. She called me a selfish snob. She accused me of turning my back on my own blood the second I put on a tailored suit. She claimed Bradley was working himself to the bone to build a legacy for our family, and that my refusal to spend a few measly minutes helping him proved I possessed no loyalty. She ended the recording by stating she hoped my fancy new colleagues knew how cold and ungrateful I truly was. I sat at my desk and listened to the recording a second time. A year ago, a message like that would have triggered a spiral of guilt and self-doubt. I would have drafted a lengthy apology, questioned my own character, and eventually caved to their demands to keep the peace. But I was not the same person who had cried on the concrete bench outside the graduation hall. My environment had changed me. I analyzed her voicemail the same way I analyzed opposing counsel's arguments. I stripped away the emotional theatrics and looked at the core facts. The fact was they were terrified. The fact was Bradley's facade was cracking under the weight of his own incompetence, and they were desperately searching for a scapegoat to blame for the impending collapse. I did not call her back. I did not text an explanation. I did not defend my character or try to justify my professional ethics. I simply archived the voicemail and let my silence do the heavy lifting. I understood that engaging with their panic would only provide them with the emotional fuel they craved. Refusing to participate was the most powerful response I could deliver. I took off my headphones and turned my attention back to the towering stacks of case law on my desk. The firm was entering its busiest quarter, and I had no energy to spare for suburban melodrama. 2 weeks later, the silence was shattered by the arrival of a new assignment. I was sitting in my office on a rainy Thursday afternoon, reviewing deposition transcripts, when a senior litigation partner knocked on my open door. He walked in carrying a thick, expandable cardboard file box. He set the heavy box down on my desk with a loud thud. The sheer volume of the paperwork indicated a complex, high-stakes dispute. The partner explained that a major corporate client, a prominent regional real estate developer, was initiating a substantial lawsuit for gross negligence and breach of contract. The partner noted that the defendants had severely mismanaged a commercial renovation project, resulting in millions of dollars in structural damage and broken lease agreements. He wanted me to take the lead on organizing the initial discovery requests and drafting the preliminary injunctions. I thanked him for the opportunity and pulled the heavy cardboard box toward me. The partner left my office, closing the door behind him. I reached for the brass clasp on the front of the file. I opened the lid and pulled out the primary case summary document sitting on top of the stack. I scanned the first page, reading the names of the corporate entities involved. The plaintiff was a well-known subsidiary of our largest institutional client. I moved my eyes down the page to the defendant section. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The primary defendant listed on the official court filing was a limited liability company registered in the state of Massachusetts. It was the exact same shell company my brother had formed. Right below the corporate name, the document listed the personal guarantors attached to the breached commercial loans. The names printed in stark black ink were my mother and my father. The two worlds I had tried so desperately to keep separated had just collided on my desk. 6 months had passed since I walked out of the housewarming party. The bitter New England winter had thawed into a damp gray spring. I spent those 6 months building an unyielding reputation at Reed and Associates. I billed 80 hours a week analyzing corporate structures and identifying legal liabilities. My family remained a distant echo during that time. They only reached out to extract free advice, which I consistently refused to provide. The silence shattered on a Sunday morning in late April. My phone vibrated on my kitchen counter. The screen displayed my father's name. I answered the call. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not inquire about my career. He issued a rigid directive. He told me I needed to attend a mandatory family dinner that evening at their house in Chestnut Hill. His voice carried a tight, strained edge that left no room for negotiation. I drove my faded sedan through the affluent suburbs as dusk settled over the city. The manicured lawns and wrought iron gates projected the same illusion of generational wealth. I parked in the cobblestone driveway and walked up to the heavy mahogany front door. The interior of the house felt hollow. No one had bothered to cook. The kitchen remained dark, devoid of the usual smells of a Sunday roast. I found my parents and Bradley sitting around the formal dining room table. The crystal chandelier overhead cast a harsh light on their exhausted faces. A thick stack of legal documents rested in the center of the polished wood. Bradley looked like a man who had not slept in weeks. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt and his leg bounced anxiously under the mahogany table. My mother clutched a shredded paper tissue in her hands. Her eyes were red and swollen. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid with defensive pride. I pulled out a chair and sat down. I did not ask for a glass of water. I waited for them to speak. My father pushed the stack of papers across the table toward me. He stated that Bradley had run into a minor legal dispute with a vendor. He told me to look at the documents and figure out a way to make the problem disappear. I picked up the thick packet. The front page bore the official seal of the Massachusetts Superior Court. It was not a minor dispute. It was a formal civil complaint. A prominent regional commercial developer was suing Bradley's limited liability company for gross negligence and breach of contract. I scanned the factual allegations outlined in the brief. Bradley had hired a discount contracting firm to handle the structural renovations on his commercial building. During the excavation process, the contractors ignored municipal zoning laws and severed a primary municipal water main. The resulting flood destroyed the foundation of a neighboring high-rise complex owned by the plaintiff. The developer was seeking millions of dollars in restitution. I turned to page 4 of the appended contract. The indemnification clause I had explicitly warned Bradley about 6 months ago stared back at me. The vendor had successfully shielded their own company from liability. Bradley's Shell Corporation bore the entire financial burden of the disaster. My mother began to weep. Her tears were not performative. They stemmed from genuine financial terror. She confessed that she and my father had co-signed the original commercial loans to help Bradley secure the property. Because Bradley's limited liability company lacked the assets to cover the damages, the plaintiff was preparing to pierce the corporate veil. The developers were moving to place liens on my parents' personal assets. The sprawling house we were sitting in, their remaining retirement portfolios, and their bank accounts were all targeted in the lawsuit. They were facing imminent financial ruin. My father leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. He did not ask for my professional opinion. He demanded my services. He instructed me to take the lawsuit to my managing partner at Reed & Associates the next morning. He expected me to leverage my internal connections to secure pro bono representation for Bradley. He framed the demand as my inherent duty to protect the family legacy. He told me it was time to prove I was a loyal daughter. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his escalating panic with my own emotion. I utilized the strict factual methodology I practiced every day in the boardroom. I explained the economic reality of corporate litigation to them. I stated that partners at my firm billed at $800 an hour. I outlined the rigorous intake process our executive committee used to vet potential clients. I told them our firm did not take charity cases, and we certainly did not represent defendants accused of gross mismanagement by underfunded shell companies. My father's face turned a deep shade of crimson. The veins in his neck strained against his collar. He accused me of turning my back on my own blood. He attempted to weaponize guilt, shouting about the years they had provided me with food and shelter. He demanded to know how I could sit there in my expensive suit and watch my family lose everything. I countered his emotional outburst with the cold reality of corporate law. I reminded him that I had reviewed the vendor contract 6 months prior. I reminded him that I had pointed out the exact indemnification clause that was now bankrupting them. I stated that he had dismissed my legal expertise as being too academic. I told him I refused to risk my hard-earned career, my ethical standing, and my license to practice law to rescue a brother who refused to read a binding document. Bradley scoffed loudly. He stopped bouncing his leg and crossed his arms over his chest. He glared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement. He called me a glorified paper pusher who only knew how to read fine print for other people. He sneered that he did not need my help anyway. He stated he was going to hire a real lawyer to crush the frivolous lawsuit and countersue the developers for harassment. I stood up from the dining room table. I did not wish them luck. I did not offer any parting advice. I turned around and walked out the front door, leaving them to face the consequences of their own willful ignorance. I drove back to my apartment in the city, feeling a strange sense of detachment. The emotional ties that usually bound a person to their family had eroded entirely, leaving only a transactional clarity. The next morning I arrived at Reed & Associates before sunrise. I poured a cup of black coffee and sat at my desk, preparing for a long day of drafting deposition outlines. A senior litigation partner knocked on my doorframe a few hours later. He walked into my office carrying a heavy cardboard file box. He set it down on my desk, explaining that our firm was initiating a substantial lawsuit on behalf of a major corporate client. He wanted me to take the lead on organizing the discovery requests. I thanked him for the opportunity. He left the room, closing the door behind him. I reached for the brass clasp on the front of the file. I opened the lid and pulled out the primary case summary document sitting on top of the stack. I scanned the first page, reading the names of the corporate entities involved. I reviewed the plaintiff list on the new litigation case. The corporate entity suing my family was a subsidiary of our firm's most lucrative real estate developer client. The defendants listed on the page were Bradley and my parents. The two worlds I had tried so desperately to keep separated had officially collided on my desk. I stared at the crisp white paper resting on my mahogany desk. The black ink spelled out a reality I needed a full minute to process. The plaintiff listed on the civil complaint was a prominent subsidiary of our firm's most lucrative real estate developer client. The defendants listed directly below were Adelaide Williams and my parents. I was not being asked to leverage my connections to defend my family. My firm was the entity actively prosecuting them. I closed the heavy cardboard file box. The ethical guidelines governing corporate law in Massachusetts remained rigid and unforgiving. Rule 1.7 of the Rules of Professional Conduct dictated that a lawyer must disclose any concurrent conflict of interest immediately. Failing to report my familial relationship to the primary defendants would jeopardize my career and risk a mistrial for the client. I stood up from my leather chair. I picked up the case summary document. I smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from my tailored skirt and walked out of my office. The corridors of Reed & Associates operated with a quiet, intimidating efficiency. Junior associates typed furiously behind glass walls, racing to meet impossible deadlines. Senior partners murmured into headsets while reviewing complex financial disclosures. I navigated the maze of authentic Oriental rugs and polished cherrywood paneling. My destination was the corner office at the far end of the hall. I prepared myself for the inevitable outcome. In the corporate legal world, a direct familial connection to opposing parties usually resulted in the establishment of a strict ethical wall. I anticipated being formally removed from the litigation team, isolated from all case files, and reassigned to a different division. I accepted this protocol. Losing my first significant assignment stung, but preserving my professional integrity mattered far more than any single lawsuit. I reached the frosted glass door bearing Jonathan Reed's name and knocked twice. A deep voice instructed me to enter. Jonathan sat behind a sprawling desk, reviewing a thick stack of printed emails. He wore a crisp white shirt, with the cuffs rolled up to his forearms, projecting a sharp, predatory focus. He looked up, and his expression remained neutral. "What do you have, Williams?" he asked. I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me. I did not waste his time with pleasantries or nervous hesitation. I walked forward, handed him the case summary document, and pointed to the defendant list. "Adelaide Williams is my biological brother. I stated clearly. The personal guarantors listed below his company name are my parents. I am formally disclosing a conflict of interest, and I am ready to sign the necessary ethical wall agreements to recuse myself from this litigation. Jonathan took the paper. He read the names. He did not blink. He did not express surprise or offer false sympathy regarding the awkwardness of the situation. He placed the document flat on his desk and intertwined his fingers. He looked at me with the same calculating intensity he possessed in the back of the town car on my graduation day. He asked a single precise question. Do you possess any insider knowledge that would compromise our client's position? I met his gaze. I stripped away every ounce of daughterly obligation and accessed the cold analytical mindset he hired me for. I hold no proprietary knowledge regarding their defense strategy because they do not possess one, I informed him. My only insider information is the fact that the defendants are legally incompetent, functionally insolvent, and highly leveraged. They operate on a foundation of entitlement and panic. They prefer to ignore binding contracts rather than read them. Jonathan studied my posture. He searched for a tremor in my voice or a flicker of emotional distress. He found nothing. He recognized that the familial bond had eroded long ago, leaving behind a sharp, objective observer. He picked up a gold pen and tapped it against the leather blotter on his desk. Opposing counsel will likely try to stall the proceedings, Jonathan noted. They will attempt to hide assets through a web of procedural delays. Having an associate who deeply understands the psychological frailties of the defendants offers an undeniable tactical advantage. He did not hand me an ethical wall agreement. He assigned me a second chair on the litigation. He instructed me to lead the discovery phase and dismantle their corporate structure piece by piece. I walked back to my office with the case summary in my hand. The assignment represented a monumental test of my professionalism. Jonathan had just handed me the scalpel and ordered me to dissect my own family on the public record. The irony hummed beneath the surface of my skin. My parents had skipped my law school graduation to celebrate a hollow business venture. They dismissed my Juris Doctor degree as a lingering academic hobby. Now I was tasked with utilizing the exact education they mocked to systematically dismantle the illusion they had bankrolled. I sat back down at my desk and opened the heavy cardboard file box. The intimidation I felt earlier vanished, replaced by a surgical clarity. I booted up my dual monitors and opened a blank legal template. The discovery phase of civil litigation is a brutal, exhaustive process designed to force hidden truths into the light. I did not plan to send a generic list of document requests. I intended to corner them with precision. I began typing the formal interrogatories and requests for production. I demanded every single bank statement, general ledger, and wire transfer associated with Bradley's limited liability company. I requested the original loan applications, searching for the fraudulent income projections I suspected they used to secure the initial funding. I drafted targeted demands for all communication records between my brother and the discount contracting firm that severed the water main. The concept of piercing the corporate veil requires proving that a company is merely an alter ego for its owners. I needed to prove Bradley commingled his personal expenses with the business accounts. I requested credit card statements, expense reports, and vehicle lease agreements. I moved on to the personal guarantors. I drafted subpoenas for my parents' retirement portfolios, index fund liquidations, and private savings accounts. I knew exactly where they hid their assets, and I systematically closed off every financial escape route. I requested their tax returns for the past 5 years to establish a baseline of their true financial health prior to funding Bradley's venture. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a steady, rhythmic cadence. Each keystroke represented a binding, legal demand that carried the full weight of the judicial system. They could not ignore these requests, the way they ignored the municipal zoning notices. Failing to comply with a formal discovery demand would result in court sanctions and default judgments. The documents I generated would mandate the production of the very financial records my parents desperately tried to hide during our tense Sunday dinner. I reviewed the final draft of the discovery request. It was a flawless, airtight legal instrument. I printed the pages, signed my name at the bottom in bold blue ink, and prepared to serve the papers that would drag their carefully constructed facade into the harsh reality of a courtroom. The courier arrived on a Tuesday morning, pushing a heavy metal hand truck loaded with 6 cardboard banker boxes. This delivery signaled the formal beginning of the discovery phase. Bradley had retained a solo practitioner operating out of a small office park in a neighboring suburb. This opposing counsel employed a classic desperate defense strategy. He attempted a document dump. He sent thousands of unsorted, unindexed pages, hoping to bury a junior associate under a mountain of irrelevant invoices and duplicate bank statements. He assumed I would drown in the paperwork. He did not realize that tracing documentation was my native language. I stayed in my office long after the administrative staff went home. The glow of the Boston skyline illuminated the glass walls, casting long shadows across the carpet. I arranged the boxes in chronological order and brewed a fresh pot of black coffee. I did not rely on paralegals to sort the files. I wanted to trace the financial architecture with my own hands. I started with the primary operating account for the limited liability company. The initial ledger entries reflected standard startup costs, showing payments for architectural surveys and municipal permits. However, as I tracked numbers into the second quarter, the facade began to disintegrate. I applied the specific analytical focus that had earned me my position at the firm. I looked past the sheer volume of data and isolated the structural anomalies. The first discrepancy appeared in a stack of transportation receipts. Bradley had authorized a monthly deduction of $1,200 for an executive vehicle lease. I cross-referenced the vendor identification number. The vehicle was a brand new imported sports car registered to Bradley's personal home address rather than the corporate office. He categorized the expense as site inspection travel. The trail of financial rot accelerated from there. I found an invoice from a luxury ski resort in Aspen, Colorado. The bill included lift tickets, spa treatments, and premium room service. The company ledger coded this expenditure as a regional real estate networking conference. I pulled credit card statements and discovered regular exorbitant charges at Michelin-starred steakhouses in downtown Boston. Bradley was treating the corporate operating account like a personal automated teller machine. I was not merely an incompetent businessman who made a tragic error during a renovation project. He was actively engaging in illegal commingling of funds. He drained the company of essential operating capital to fund an affluent lifestyle he had never earned. The emotional gravity of the audit shifted when I opened the fourth box. This container held the loan modification documents and the secondary financing applications. When Bradley ran out of the initial seed money my parents provided, he sought emergency capital from a regional commercial lender. Securing those secondary loans required personal guarantors to submit verified proof of income and formal expense audits. I spread the loan applications across my mahogany desk. The signature lines at the bottom of the pages bore the distinct familiar handwriting of my mother and father. I compared the submitted expense reports against the actual bank statements I had just audited. The numbers did not align. The documents my parents signed explicitly certified that the company was generating steady revenue and maintaining strict overhead controls. They knowingly omitted the sports car lease. They deliberately concealed the ski trips and the luxury dining expenses. They classified personal discretionary spending as essential structural improvements. A cold realization washed over me, settling deep into my chest. For years I believed my parents simply favored the golden child. I thought they were blinded by a misguided traditional preference for their son. The documents resting on my desk proved a far darker reality. They did not just look the other way while Bradley failed. They actively participated in a coordinated financial crime to prop up his illusion of success. They falsified legal records to secure lending, committing systemic bank fraud to protect his fragile ego. The favoritism was a shield for criminal complicity. By Friday afternoon, the opposing counsel realized the document dump had failed to slow my progress. He initiated the second phase of his stalling tactics. He filed a formal objection to my request for the remaining personal banking records of the guarantors. He cited vague privacy concerns and claimed the documents were irrelevant to a corporate breach of contract dispute. He attempted to build a legal wall around my parents' personal accounts to prevent me from exposing the extent of their fraud. I sat down at my keyboard and opened a blank legal pleading. I did not draft a generic response complaining about procedural delays. I drafted a razor-sharp motion to compel the production of evidence. I stripped away the polite legal pleasantries and laid out the facts with surgical precision. I cited the specific dates of the Aspen trip. I listed the exact transaction numbers for the sports car lease payments. I included the routing numbers of the concealed accounts. I argued that the blatant commingling of funds voided any expectation of financial privacy. I established that the limited liability company was a fraudulent alter ego, making the personal financial records of the guarantors highly relevant and discoverable under the legal standard for piercing the corporate veil. I printed the motion, signed the bottom with a bold stroke of my pen, and handed it to the firm's courier. The legal document was officially filed with the court and served to the opposing counsel via certified electronic delivery. The legal system operates on strict notification rules. When a formal motion is filed, the defense attorney is required to forward a copy to their clients to discuss strategy. I knew the opposing counsel would receive the electronic filing by 3 o'clock. I knew he would panic when he read the specific transaction dates. I knew he would immediately print the document and send it to his clients. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing case law, waiting for the inevitable collision. The cover page of a legal motion always bears the name, title, and firm of the drafting attorney. For 6 months, my parents believed I was a selfish daughter who had abandoned them to push papers in a corporate library. They believed their hired lawyer was handling a routine contract dispute. They had no idea who was building the case against them. At 5:15 in the evening, the sun dipped below the Boston skyline, casting the office in a cool gray light. The landline phone on my desk rang. The digital caller identification screen lit up, displaying my father's cell phone number. The ringing sound echoed through the quiet office, sharp and persistent. He had received the motion. He had seen my name printed in bold letters under the header of Reed and Associates. The ringing continued. The sound carried a distinct, undeniable frequency of a man whose entire world had just collapsed. His voice on the other end of that line would not be full of the usual arrogant demands. It would be shaking with a chaotic mixture of rage and sheer terror. The landline on my desk chirped its insistent digital tone. My father's name glowed on the small liquid crystal display. The ringing echoed through the quiet space of my office, carrying a distinct frequency of panic. I did not reach for the receiver. The American Bar Association enforces strict ethical boundaries, and communicating directly with a party represented by outside counsel constitutes a severe violation. My father possessed legal representation, however, outmatched that representation might be. I watched the red light blink as the call rolled to voicemail. 5 seconds later, the phone rang again, then a third time. They had read the motion to compel. They had seen the transaction dates for the sports car and the ski resort, laid bare in black and white. The illusion they had meticulously curated for years was currently sitting in a public court docket under my signature. I muted the ringer, packed my briefcase, and headed for the elevator bank. Reed and Associates occupied the top 12 floors of a modern glass skyscraper in the financial district. The ground floor lobby served as an architectural statement of power. Vast expanses of imported Italian marble stretched toward a soaring atrium. Water cascaded down a sleek granite feature wall, creating a continuous calming white noise designed to soothe anxious clients holding millions of dollars in corporate assets. I stepped out of the brass elevator doors, adjusting the leather strap of my briefcase, ready to hail a taxi and return to my apartment. I did not make it to the revolving doors. A sharp, shrill voice cut through the ambient sound of the cascading water. My mother called my name. The pitch of her voice bounced off the marble walls, turning the heads of 2 passing paralegals. I stopped and turned around. My family stood near the main security desk. They had bypassed the visitor registration protocol, likely by slipping past a delivery courier holding the electronic turnstile open. My father led the charge, His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Bradley walked a step behind him, hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking remarkably small despite his tailored linen shirt. My mother flanked them, clutching a designer handbag against her chest like a shield. They did not belong in this environment. Their brand of loud suburban entitlement clashed horribly with the hushed, calculated professionalism of the firm. My father marched toward me, closing the distance rapidly. He raised a crumpled printout of my legal motion in his right hand, waving the papers in the air. He demanded to know what kind of sick game I was playing. His voice carried across the expansive space, drawing the attention of a senior tax partner who paused near the concierge desk. I did not step backward. I did not lower my gaze. I stood firmly in place, letting them approach. My mother launched into her performance before my father could formulate his next sentence. She let out a loud, theatrical sob. She pressed her fingers to her lips, ensuring the gathering audience of corporate attorneys and wealthy clients witnessed her maternal anguish. She accused me of plotting to destroy my own blood out of petty jealousy. She cried out that I had always resented Bradley for his entrepreneurial spirit, claiming I was using my fancy new job to punish them for supporting his dreams. She painted a picture of a bitter, vindictive daughter who could not stand to see her brother succeed. The performance was designed to inflict maximum social pressure. In a country club setting or a neighborhood barbecue, that tactic would have successfully forced me into submission. It was a calculated attempt to make me shrink, to make me apologize, to make me prioritize their public comfort over my own boundaries. The tension in the lobby grew palpable. Clients in tailored suits slowed their pace, watching the domestic drama unfold in a space reserved for high finance. They severely miscalculated their venue. I did not match their hysteria. I did not defend my childhood or point out the hypocrisy of their accusations. I deployed a chilling, unbreakable calm. I let a heavy silence hang between us for 5 full seconds, forcing them to absorb the sheer lack of impact their emotional outbursts produced. When I finally spoke, I kept my vocal register low and even. I projected just enough volume to be heard clearly over the water feature. I informed my father that he was currently represented by legal counsel. I stated that any direct communication with me regarding an active civil complaint constituted a breach of legal ethics. I told him he needed to direct his grievances to his hired attorney, who would then contact my office through the proper channels. My father sputtered, attempting to interrupt. He insisted that I was his daughter and he would speak to me whenever he pleased. I raised my hand, a subtle but firm gesture that stopped his momentum. I explained that I was not standing in front of him as his daughter. I was standing in front of him as opposing counsel. I shifted my focus to my mother, who was currently attempting to squeeze a fresh tear from her eye. I told her the theatrical display held zero currency in this building. I informed the 3 of them that their unauthorized presence in the lobby qualified as targeted harassment of a litigating attorney. I delivered the final, undeniable consequence with surgical precision. I stated that if they did not turn around and walk out the revolving doors in the next 10 seconds, I would signal the building security team to escort them off the premises. I added that I would immediately file a formal restraining order documenting their physical ambush and verbal harassment. I clarified that this restraining order would become a matter of public court record. I watched my father absorb the reality that a permanent public injunction would destroy their remaining credit score and shatter whatever social standing they had left in Chestnut Hill. The threat of a public stain on their reputation achieved what years of reasoning never could. The blood drained from my father's face. The crumpled legal motion in his hand lowered to his side. Bradley took a distinct step backward, his eyes darting nervously toward the muscular security guards stationed near the turnstiles. My mother stopped crying instantly. The tears dried up, replaced by a stark, terrified realization. Their suburban melodrama held no power against cold, systemic legal authority. They were outmatched, outclassed, and entirely exposed. My father swallowed hard, his throat working against his collar. He opened his mouth to deliver a parting insult, but his voice failed him. He turned on his heel and marched toward the exit. Bradley and my mother followed close behind their heads, bowed in profound humiliation. They pushed through the revolving glass doors and disappeared into the fading evening light. I let out a slow, controlled breath. The tension in my shoulders began to ease. I adjusted my grip on my briefcase and prepared to leave. As I turned toward the exit, a slight movement above caught my attention. I glanced up toward the second-floor mezzanine, a structural balcony that overlooked the main lobby. Jonathan Reed stood near the glass railing. He held a ceramic coffee mug in one hand, watching the scene unfold below. Our eyes met across the expansive vertical space. He did not smile. He did not offer a thumbs up or any overt display of congratulation. He simply offered a single deliberate nod of approval. He had watched me draw a line in the sand and defend it with ruthless efficiency. The family ambush had failed, but it meant the battle was far from over. The real dismantling would happen under oath in a deposition room. The deposition took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in Conference Room 4. The space featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the Boston Harbor. The overcast sky cast a flat gray light across the polished oak table. A certified court reporter sat at the far end quietly setting up her stenography machine. I sat next to Jonathan Reed, arranging my color-coded folders in precise alignment. My parents arrived at the firm at 9:45. They attempted to follow Bradley into the conference room, acting as an emotional shield for their son. The receptionist politely but firmly intercepted them. She informed my mother and father that non-parties to the lawsuit were prohibited from attending a formal deposition. She directed them to a waiting area near the elevators. I watched through the glass walls as my parents sank into the leather waiting chairs, their faces tight with anxiety. They were finally forced to remain on the outside, unable to manipulate a process governed entirely by sworn testimony. Bradley walked into the room accompanied by his attorney. The solo practitioner wore a rumpled gray suit and carried a disorganized leather briefcase. He looked exhausted before the proceedings even began. Bradley, however, attempted to project confidence. He wore a sharp navy blazer and an expensive watch. He took a seat across from me, adjusted his cuffs, and offered a tight, patronizing smile. He believed he was walking into a family dispute. He did not understand he was stepping into a legal trap. The court reporter swore Bradley in. Jonathan Reed handled the preliminary questions, establishing the timeline of the commercial real estate venture and the initial loan agreements. Bradley answered with practiced ease, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. He spoke smoothly, clearly accustomed to talking his way out of minor inconveniences. After 40 minutes. Jonathan paused. He checked his notepad, closed his pen, and folded his hands on the table. He announced that his junior associate would lead the questioning regarding the specific financial expenditures of the limited liability company. He turned the floor over to me. Bradley let out a quiet scoff. He shifted in his seat, his posture relaxing even further. He looked at me with the same casual arrogance he displayed at his housewarming party. He assumed I would stumble, expecting the quiet sister who used to take his criticism without a fight. I did not offer a greeting. I picked up my first folder and pulled out a stack of corporate bank statements. I began with the foundational questions. I asked Bradley to confirm his role as the sole managing member of the company. I asked him to verify that he held exclusive authority over the operating account. He answered in the affirmative, his tone dripping with bored condescension. He even added a remark about how I always struggled to understand business structures, attempting to undermine my authority on the official transcript. I ignored the jab. I slid the first document across the polished oak table. I presented Exhibit A verified copy of the company ledger from the previous November. I directed his attention to a specific line item. I asked him to read the entry aloud for the record. Bradley squinted at the page. He cleared his throat and read the description. The entry detailed a wire transfer of $12,000 to a luxury automotive dealership. I asked him to confirm the purpose of this expenditure. Bradley waved a hand dismissively. He claimed it was a standard corporate vehicle lease. He stated that successful real estate developers needed to project an image of prosperity to secure high-end clients. He defended the purchase as a vital marketing expense. I reached into my folder and produced Exhibit B. I slid a copy of the official vehicle registration across the table. I asked him to read the registered address printed on the form. Bradley hesitated. His eyes darted toward his attorney, who was scrambling to find the corresponding document in his disorganized briefcase. Bradley looked back at the paper. He mumbled his personal home address. I asked him to speak up so the court reporter could record his answer accurately. He repeated his personal home address, his voice losing a fraction of its prior confidence. I moved seamlessly to the next transaction. I presented a sequence of receipts from a ski resort in Aspen. The total expenditure exceeded $8,000, including first-class airfare, spa services, and premium dining. I asked him to explain how a ski vacation in Colorado served the business interests of a commercial real estate company operating entirely in Massachusetts. Bradley shifted his weight, the leather chair squeaking under the sudden movement. A thin layer of sweat appeared on his forehead. He tried to deploy his usual charm, flashing a forced smile. He addressed me by my childhood nickname and suggested that I knew how much pressure he was under during that quarter. He attempted to frame the trip as a necessary mental health retreat for an overworked executive. I reminded him that he was under oath. I stated that the court reporter could not transcribe a childhood nickname. I instructed him to answer the question with a valid business justification or admit that he used corporate funds for a personal vacation. His attorney intervened, raising a weak objection regarding the relevance of the travel expenses. I countered immediately, citing the specific legal standard for piercing the corporate veil. I noted that establishing a pattern of commingled funds was directly relevant to the plaintiff's claim against the personal guarantors. Jonathan Reed sat silently beside me, radiating silent approval as I dominated the procedural exchange. The opposing counsel withdrew his objection, sinking lower into his seat. I did not give Bradley a moment to recover. I increased the tempo of the questioning. I laid out a relentless sequence of financial records, creating a physical mountain of evidence between us. I presented credit card statements showing thousands of dollars spent at upscale steakhouses, exclusive nightclubs, and designer clothing boutiques. I detailed transactions that occurred on Tuesday afternoons and Thursday mornings, exposing a lifestyle wholly detached from any actual labor. For every deflective answer he provided, I produced a signed receipt bearing his distinctive, messy signature. I forced him to read each fraudulent categorization aloud, ensuring the court reporter captured every syllable. I made him testify that he labeled a $600 bar tab as a client networking event, despite having 0 clients listed on the company roster. I made him admit that he coded luxury clothing purchases as essential office supplies. The stack of paper on his side of the table grew higher, a visual representation of his compounding guilt. The emotional payoff unfolded in real time. The golden child armor built on years of parental enabling and unearned praise shattered under the unforgiving scrutiny of a sworn deposition. Bradley could not charm his way out of a paper trail. He could not rely on our parents to bail him out or validate his poor choices. He sat isolated in the glass room, stripped of his illusions entirely, at the mercy of the sister he had spent his life mocking. His posture collapsed. The arrogant lean vanished, replaced by a rigid defensive hunch. His voice dropped to a nervous stammer. He tried to claim he simply made a few accounting errors, blaming his lack of formal bookkeeping training. I pulled out the final piece of evidence. I produced the secondary loan applications that our parents had co-signed. I placed the documents directly in front of him. I pointed to the submitted expense reports attached to the applications. I asked Bradley if he had reviewed those reports before his parents signed them under penalty of perjury. He stared at the loan documents. The color drained from his face entirely. He realized the trap I had built. If he admitted he knew the expense reports were falsified to hide his personal spending, he was confessing to systemic bank fraud. If he claimed he did not know, he was admitting gross incompetence and opening his parents up to severe legal liability for submitting fraudulent financial statements to a commercial lender. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His breath hitched in his throat. He looked at me with wide, panicked eyes, silently pleading for the familial loyalty he had never once shown me. I met his gaze with unwavering professional detachment. I held the silence, letting the weight of his perjury hang in the air, waiting for his answer to be recorded for the official transcript. His attorney finally recognized the catastrophic danger his client faced. The lawyer slammed his hand down on the oak table, knocking over a plastic cup of water. The liquid spilled across his disorganized notes. He loudly announced that he was calling for an emergency recess. He stated he needed to confer privately with his client immediately. I nodded slowly. I gathered my folders and stacked them in a neat, precise pile. I noted for the record that the defense had requested a recess. I watched the opposing counsel grab Bradley by the arm and pull him out of the glass conference room, leaving the fraudulent loan documents sitting on the table. The emergency recess lasted 45 minutes. I remained seated in conference room 4, organizing my evidence folders into precise, aligned stacks. Jonathan Reed sat beside me reviewing corporate emails on a slim tablet. He did not offer small talk. He did not ask how I felt about dismantling my brother on the official record. The quiet, sterile atmosphere of the glass room contrasted sharply with the unseen panic occurring behind closed doors down the hallway. When the heavy oak door finally opened, Bradley did not return. His attorney walked in alone. The rumpled gray suit looked even more disheveled than before, and his posture carried the heavy burden of total defeat. He did not sit down. He stood at the edge of the polished table and asked to discuss a settlement. The solo practitioner did not attempt to bargain. He understood the profound peril his client faced. Exposing the falsified loan applications in open court would trigger a mandatory referral to the district attorney for systemic bank fraud. A civil trial would guarantee financial ruin, but a criminal investigation guaranteed a federal prison sentence. He offered a full capitulation to spare Bradley from criminal charges. Jonathan Reed closed his tablet. He informed the opposing counsel that our firm would draft the settlement terms and forward the documents by the end of the business day. He clarified that we would not entertain counteroffers or revisions under any circumstances. The attorney nodded silently, packed his disorganized briefcase, and left the room. I spent the entire afternoon drafting the settlement agreement. I did not write a compromise. I authored a document of unconditional surrender. The terms required the immediate and total liquidation of Bradley's limited liability company. The corporate entity would dissolve its remaining physical assets, auctioned to satisfy the outstanding developer liens. The primary casualty of this liquidation was the commercial property itself, but the damage extended much further. The agreement mandated the immediate sale of Bradley's suburban house, the exact same property my parents purchased to prop up his entrepreneurial facade. Furthermore, the remaining debt required a strict, inescapable repayment structure. I drafted a clause instituting a mandatory wage garnishment for my brother spanning the next decade. A significant percentage of his future earnings would automatically funnel into a trust to reimburse the plaintiff. He would spend the next 10 years working entry-level jobs to pay off a disaster he created out of sheer arrogance. The most devastating collateral damage fell upon the personal guarantors. My parents had tied their remaining retirement funds and index portfolios to the initial commercial loans. By agreeing to the settlement and assuming the corporate debt to avoid a criminal trial, their financial safety net evaporated. The reserves they spent a lifetime building were wiped out in a single keystroke. I typed the clauses with a steady, rhythmic cadence. I felt no guilt. I did not cause their ruin. I merely illuminated the math they chose to ignore. The numbers held no bias. They simply reflected the reality of living beyond one's means to sustain a fragile ego. By 8 o'clock that evening, the office emptied out. The administrative staff went home, leaving the 42nd floor bathed in the soft hum of the ventilation system. The Boston skyline glittered outside my window, casting bright reflections across the glass walls of my office. I printed the final version of the settlement agreement. The thick stack of warm paper felt heavy in my hands. I placed the document on my desk and picked up my fountain pen. I signed my name on the final page as the drafting attorney of record. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the dark blue ink of my signature. A profound silence settled over the room. My mind drifted back to a crisp May afternoon 1 year ago. I remembered the rough texture of the concrete bench outside the Langdale Hall auditorium. I remembered the distinct hollow ache in my chest as I listened to my father dismiss my graduation ceremony to attend a housewarming party. They had prioritized Bradley's unearned milestone over my grueling academic victory. They refused to carve out 2 hours of their schedule to watch me accept the degree that defined my future. Now that same degree dictated their reality. The family who could not find the time to witness my initiation into the legal profession was now legally bound by a document bearing my signature. They were trapped inside a financial prison built by the very education they had diminished. The symmetry of the situation carried a poetic, undeniable weight. I had not screamed. I had not thrown a tantrum to force them to see my value. I simply went to work, mastered my craft, and waited for their own negligence to deliver them to my desk. I thought about the janitor who made the phone call. Thomas had recognized a work ethic my own parents chose to overlook. He saw the sleepless nights and the relentless drive validating my struggle with a single recommendation. Because of that brief moment of unearned kindness from a stranger, I now held the power to sever the toxic financial ties that bound my family together. I placed the signed settlement into a thick manila envelope and handed it to the late-night courier. The package was dispatched to the opposing counsel for final execution. The following morning, the executed documents arrived at the firm. I opened the envelope and spread the pages across my desk. Bradley and my parents had signed every page. Their signatures looked frantic and rushed a stark contrast to the confident loops they used on the fraudulent loan applications. The ink formalized their defeat. The plaintiff accepted the terms, the court dismissed the civil complaint with prejudice, and the limited liability company officially ceased to exist. The legal battle concluded, but the fallout was only just beginning. Stripped of the corporate shield and facing the immediate liquidation of their assets, the reality of their situation finally breached their suburban bubble. Without the illusion of Bradley's success to protect their pride, they lost their primary coping mechanism. The structural collapse of their finances triggered a desperate visceral panic. They could no longer hide behind lawyers or arrogant dismissals. The legal boundaries were set, but the emotional boundaries were about to be tested in a much more personal setting. On a quiet Sunday morning, my apartment buzzer rang. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing a new case file and drinking a cup of black coffee when the harsh electronic tone pierced the silence of my home. I walked to the intercom and checked the video feed. My parents stood on the sidewalk below. Their faces looked drawn and exhausted, stripped of the country club veneer they wore so proudly at the housewarming party. They had not come to ambush me in a corporate lobby. They had come to the only place they had left to go, seeking a salvation they had never earned. The harsh electronic tone of my apartment intercom shattered the quiet Sunday morning. I stood in my small kitchen, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, and stared at the security monitor mounted on the wall. My parents stood on the sidewalk 3 stories below. They huddled together against the damp spring chill. Their posture lacked the rigid country club arrogance they usually carried. They looked small, frantic, and entirely out of place in my working-class Somerville neighborhood. For years, my parents refused to cross the threshold of this building. They viewed my modest walk-up as a temporary staging ground for a failed career. They told their affluent friends that I was living in a starter apartment while I figured out my long-term plans, deliberately ignoring the fact that I paid my own rent through grueling study schedules and sheer determination. Now they were buzzing my unit, seeking sanctuary in the very space they had previously dismissed as unworthy of their presence. I pressed the button to unlock the main lobby doors. I listened to their heavy footsteps echoing up the narrow, warped wooden staircase. I unlocked my front door and pulled it open before they could knock. My father stepped into the cramped hallway, first followed closely by my mother. They looked stripped of their defensive armor. My father wore a faded wool sweater instead of his tailored golf attire. My mother clutched her handbag tightly, her eyes red and puffy from a lack of sleep. She did not wear her signature pearl necklace. I wondered if she had pawned the jewelry to cover the retainer for Bradley's disgraced attorney. They stood awkwardly in the center of my living room, shifting their weight on the worn area rug. I did not block their path. I operated with the deliberate, measured pacing of a host welcoming distant acquaintances. I gestured toward the small dining table situated near the window. I invited them to sit down. I asked if they wanted a cup of coffee. My mother nodded silently, her gaze wandering around the room. She took in the neat stacks of legal briefs on my coffee table, and the framed Juris Doctor degree, resting proudly on my bookshelf. I walked into the kitchen and prepared a French press. The rhythmic sound of boiling water filled the silence of the apartment. I brought 2 fresh mugs to the table and set them down in front of them. I took a seat across the narrow wooden surface, folding my hands together over my knees. I did not prompt the conversation. I waited patiently for them to present their case. My father stared at the dark liquid in his cup. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and hesitant. He began by outlining the immediate devastating fallout of the settlement agreement. The liquidators had already seized Bradley's commercial property. The bank had officially initiated foreclosure proceedings on my brother's suburban home. The crushing reality, however, centered on their own primary residence. The commercial lenders were preparing to execute the liens on their Chestnut Hill estate by the end of the month. They were 30 days away from losing the home they had owned for 2 decades. His voice gained momentum as he pivoted from recounting the facts to deploying his emotional leverage. He leaned across the small table, his eyes wide with a frantic, unearned expectation. He reminded me that I worked for one of the most profitable corporate law firms in Boston. He cited my 6-figure starting salary, a number he had clearly researched or calculated based on industry market averages. He stated that I possessed the liquid capital to issue them a personal bridge loan. He framed this financial rescue not as a request, but as a fundamental, unavoidable obligation. I invoked the years they spent providing me with food, shelter, and basic necessities during my childhood. He argued that shared blood dictated a reciprocal duty. He claimed that children owed their parents salvation in times of crisis. He insisted that allowing the people who raised me to face eviction when I held a lucrative income constituted a profound moral failure on my part. He spoke with the conviction of a man who believed a shared last name functioned as a blank check. My mother joined the chorus, utilizing her preferred tactic of weaponized vulnerability. She reached across the table and attempted to grasp my hand. I pulled my fingers back, leaving her palm resting on the bare wood. She withdrew her arm, her lower lip trembling. She pleaded that they had simply made a misguided investment in my brother. She begged me to overlook the past and remember the family bond. She promised they would pay me back with interest once they restructured their remaining debts. She cried quietly, letting the tears track down her cheeks, waiting for me to break. I sat in my chair and listened. I did not interrupt their desperate monologues. I did not raise my voice to point out the glaring hypocrisy of their arguments. A year ago, I might have engaged in a bitter shouting match. I would have demanded to know why they skipped my graduation. I would have yelled about the thousands of hours I spent fighting for my own survival while they handed Bradley the world on a silver platter. I would have sought closure through loud, messy conflict. That version of me no longer existed. My environment and my legal training had rewired my emotional responses. I observed their manipulation with a clinical, detached fascination. I recognized the specific scripts they were reciting. They relied on guilt, obligation, and archaic definitions of family loyalty. They believed that appealing to my conscience would override my intellect. They assumed I craved their approval so deeply that I would purchase it with my hard-earned salary. I let them talk until they ran out of words. The silence stretched across the small apartment, thick and suffocating. The coffee in their mugs grew cold. My father sat back in his chair, breathing heavily, waiting for me to pull out a checkbook and write the number that would save his pride. I stood up from the dining table. I walked over to the small wooden desk stationed in the corner of my living room. I did not open my purse. I did not reach for my bank ledger. I picked up a single crisp piece of printer paper. I turned around and walked back to the table. The floorboards creaked under my steps. My parents watched my hands, a spark of desperate hope igniting in their eyes. They believed they had won. They thought the old dynamic had held firm, that the obedient, overlooked daughter had returned to fix the mess created by the golden son. I extended my arm and handed the paper to my father. I took it eagerly, expecting to see a drafted promissory note, a cashier's check, or a formal loan agreement. He adjusted his posture, preparing to offer a brief, patronizing word of thanks. He looked down at the document resting in his hands. He read the header, His eyes scanned the first few lines of text. The spark of hope extinguished instantly. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The paper in my father's hands was not a cashier's check. It was not a promissory note, a trust document, or a transfer authorization from my personal bank account. It was a formal itemized invoice printed on heavy stock paper. His eyes darted across the top of the page, registering the bold black text. I had formatted the document to mirror the exact billing structure we utilized in the commercial litigation department at Reed & Associates. The header displayed my full name and my professional credentials. Below the header, a table outlined a specific date, a detailed description of services rendered, an hourly billing rate, and a final balance due. He stared at the total printed at the bottom of the page. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He asked me what kind of sick joke I was playing. I kept my voice level and quiet. I informed him it was not a joke. I told him it was a binding bill for the legal consulting services I provided on a Saturday afternoon in May. He looked back down at the paper. He read the description line aloud, his voice stumbling over the terminology. The text detailed a contractual risk assessment and liability identification regarding a commercial vendor agreement. He squinted at the page, trying to connect the clinical language to his current reality. I clarified the event for him. I reminded him of Bradley's catered housewarming party. I reminded him of the crumpled paper my brother tossed onto the kitchen island between plates of expensive appetizers. I recounted how I had read the indemnification clause, identified the fatal liability trap, and explicitly warned them both that the vendor was shifting all operational risk onto their shoulders. I reminded him that my advice, if taken, would have prevented the lawsuit currently bankrupting them and saving their house from foreclosure. My father's grip on the paper tightened, crinkling the sharp edges. He argued that we were at a family party. He claimed I was just glancing at a piece of paper for my brother as a quick favor. I leaned back in my chair. I explained that a licensed attorney reviewing a commercial contract and identifying structural liabilities constitutes professional legal counsel. I noted my current billing rate stood at $800 an hour. I told him that I offered them my expertise for free that day, but he chose to dismiss my warning as too academic. He preferred the comforting delusion of Bradley's business acumen over the factual reality of my legal training. I stated that my expertise possessed a tangible market value and they could no longer afford it. My mother let out a sharp gasp. She placed her hands on the dining table, her knuckles turning white against the wood. She accused me of being heartless. She demanded to know how I could sit there and hand my own father a bill while they were on the verge of losing the home they had lived in for 2 decades. I looked directly into her eyes. I told her that family functions as a reciprocal contract. The concept requires mutual consideration, respect, and investment to remain valid. I explained that a contract becomes void when one party consistently fails to uphold their obligations while demanding endless performance from the other. I methodically recounted the history of their breach. I did not raise my voice. I presented the facts as if laying out a timeline for a jury during opening statements. I detailed the years they poured their financial resources and emotional energy exclusively into Bradley. I mentioned the countless times I was expected to shrink myself and hide my intellect to protect his fragile ego. I pointed out their active participation in falsifying loan documents to sustain his facade, a choice that directly caused their current financial ruin. I brought the timeline to its final definitive conclusion. I painted the picture of a crisp afternoon on the law school campus. I described the heavy velvet valedictorian gown, the cold concrete bench, and the hollow silence of the courtyard. I reminded them that they chose to skip the culmination of my academic career to drink champagne at a house purchased with their retirement funds. They deemed my monumental professional achievement less important than my brother's fabricated success. They treated my graduation as an inconvenience they could reschedule for a later date. My father opened his mouth to defend himself. He tried to claim they were just trying to help Bradley get on his feet because the business world was tough. He insisted they loved us both equally and never meant to make me feel lesser. I stopped him with a single raised hand. I stated that equity requires action, not empty sentiment. I explained that they had consistently bet against my potential. They refused to invest in my education, my career, or my emotional well-being. They left me to build my foundation out of scraps, while they handed my brother a castle made of sand. They chose their legacy, and now they were watching it wash away. My mother began to weep. Her shoulders shook as the reality of her situation collided with her inability to manipulate my emotions. She deployed the final desperate defense of a failing parent. She sobbed that they had done their best. She claimed they made mistakes but always tried to provide a good life for us. She begged me to show some compassion for the people who put a roof over my head when I was a child. I refused to validate the tears. I recognized the tactic for what it was. It was a plea for absolution, a demand that I absorb the consequences of their poor choices to spare them from facing their own guilt. I stood up from the dining table. The wooden legs of my chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the sound sharp and final in the small apartment. I looked down at the two people who had spent my entire life underestimating me. I delivered the final verdict. I told them they did not invest in my future, so they did not get to draw dividends from my success. The words hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. My father stared at me. The last remnants of his paternal authority dissolved into the silence. He recognized the shift in the power dynamic. He could no longer command my obedience or extract my resources. He held no leverage. The daughter he had marginalized for 25 years had just evicted him from her life, using the very logic he worshipped. I walked past the dining table and moved toward the entryway. I reached for the brass knob on my front door. I turned the latch and pulled the door wide open. The cool air from the stairwell rushed into the apartment. I looked back at my parents. I did not scream. I did not ask for an apology or closure. I simply asked them to leave. My father stood up slowly. He looked older than he had when he walked in 10 minutes prior. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by a hollow resignation. He folded the itemized invoice in half and slipped it into the pocket of his faded wool sweater. He reached for my mother's arm, gently guiding her up from the chair. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She did not look at me as they walked toward the door. They moved with the slow, shuffling gait of defeated litigants, leaving a courtroom after a devastating verdict. They stepped out into the narrow hallway, their shoulders slumped under the weight of their impending bankruptcy and the loss of their social standing. They finally understood the math. They realized the daughter they erased had erased them in return. The ledger was balanced and the account was permanently closed. I stood in the doorway and watched them walk toward the stairs. I did not say goodbye. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a solid, satisfying metallic thud. I leaned against the doorframe and closed my eyes. I expected to feel a surge of guilt or a lingering sense of familial grief. Instead, an overwhelming sense of lightness washed over my chest. The crushing gravity of their expectations vanished. I walked back into my kitchen, picked up my ceramic mug, and took a sip of my coffee. The apartment was quiet, and for the first time in my life, the silence belonged entirely to me. The quiet following the closed door of my apartment lasted for several months. It was a productive, insulating silence. I immersed myself in the rigorous rhythm of Reed and Associates. I billed hours, drafted summary judgments, and built a robust portfolio that senior partners began to request by name. My career accelerated on a firm foundation of verified facts. Across the Charles River in the affluent enclaves of Chestnut Hill, my family attempted to build a new foundation on fiction. The Gossip Network in suburban Massachusetts operates with lethal efficiency. Word of Bradley losing his commercial property leaked into the country club dining rooms and charity gala planning committees long before the moving trucks arrived at my parents' estate. To mitigate their plummeting social currency, my mother and father deployed a frantic public relations campaign. They attended their usual social engagements with forced smiles. They cornered old friends near the tennis courts and golf carts. They spun a tragic narrative, casting themselves as the devoted victims of a heartless corporate daughter. They claimed I used my elite legal connections to sabotage my own brother out of deep-seated jealousy. They told anyone who would listen that I orchestrated a hostile takeover of his burgeoning business. They painted my demand for accountability as an act of ruthless familial betrayal. For a brief period, the suburban echo chamber offered them comfort. Wealthy neighbors offered tight smiles and murmured condolences for their sudden domestic tragedy. The sympathy expired rapidly. The Boston legal and corporate community functions as a surprisingly intimate ecosystem. In a city governed by academic prestige and financial metrics, country club gossip holds zero weight against a public court docket. The settlement agreement I drafted was not a sealed document. It was a recorded legal instrument filed with the Massachusetts Superior Court. Any curious loan officer, real estate developer, or nosy neighbor possessing basic internet access could pull the file, and they did pull the file. The facts contained in the settlement laid bare the exact architecture of Bradley's incompetence. The public record detailed the severed water main, the predatory vendor contract, and the systemic commingling of corporate funds. It outlined the fraudulent loan applications my parents signed under penalty of perjury. The community read the itemized list of sports car lease payments and luxury ski resort invoices funded by unauthorized commercial debt. The truth eradicated their carefully cultivated social facade. The invitations to summer cocktail parties stopped arriving in their mailbox. Their longtime friends suddenly found themselves too busy to schedule weekend brunches. The silence of the elite is a very specific freezing isolation. My parents learned that people in their tax bracket will forgive many things, but they will never forgive bad math and public embarrassment. Their social standing evaporated, burned away by the harsh light of their own documented financial negligence. The economic reality of the settlement required swift enforcement. The commercial lenders did not care about my mother's tears or my father's bruised pride. The banks cared only about recouping their losses. The lending institutions executed the lines on the Chestnut Hill estate. My parents were forced to pack up 2 decades of accumulated status symbols. They sold the mahogany dining table where they once demanded I rescue them for free. They vacated the sprawling colonial structure and signed a lease on a cramped 2-bedroom condominium in a vastly different zip code. Bradley faced an even steeper descent into the realities of the working class. The settlement mandated a rigid wage garnishment to satisfy the outstanding debt to the commercial developers. Stripped of his shell company and our parents' funding, he held no financial leverage. He possessed no actual marketable skills, no graduate degrees, and no authentic professional network to catch him when he fell. The golden child who had spent his entire adult life being handed executive titles and luxury assets was forced to enter the labor market at the very bottom. He could no longer play the role of the visionary founder. He was just another indebted citizen searching for a weekly paycheck to keep his head above water. He secured a position working the front desk at a regional logistics firm in the industrial suburbs. His new reality consisted of answering multi-line phone systems, organizing physical filing cabinets, and scheduling calendar appointments for middle managers who were younger than him. The Human Resources Department at his new job processed the court-ordered wage garnishment on his first day. A substantial percentage of every paycheck he earned was automatically diverted to the plaintiff's trust account before the funds ever reached his personal bank account. He traded his tailored linen shirts and imported sports cars for a polyester uniform polo and a public transit pass. He packed lunches in paper bags instead of dining at expensive steakhouses. He was finally experiencing the crushing, exhausting grind of entry-level labor that I had endured for years to fund my own education. I monitored these developments from a distance. I did not hire private investigators or stalk their social media profiles. The updates trickled in naturally through the interconnected Boston legal network. A colleague mentioned the sale of the estate during a lunch break. A paralegal recognized Bradley's name on a garnishment processing form. I listened to these updates without experiencing a surge of vindictive joy. I did not celebrate their downfall. The reality of their ruin carried a sobering weight. I did not seek revenge when I drafted the settlement. I did not orchestrate a malicious scheme to steal their wealth or banish them from their community. I merely enforced an immovable legal boundary. The destruction of their lifestyle was the natural mathematical result of their own actions. They chose to fund a delusion. They chose to sign fraudulent documents. They chose to ignore expert advice to protect a fragile ego. When their reckless choices collided with the unforgiving structure of corporate law, the structure held firm. The facade shattered. Justice in the legal world is rarely poetic. It is usually just a strict accounting of debts, and their debts had finally come due. As the crisp autumn weather returned to the city, the dust of the litigation finally settled. My life achieved a steady upward trajectory. I was entrusted with leading client meetings. I presented arguments in federal court. I earned the respect of the senior partners, not through my lineage, but through the undeniable quality of my work. The ghost of my family's expectations no longer haunted my office. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, the internal mail courier knocked on my open door. He placed a small stack of sorted correspondence on the corner of my desk. Most of the items were standard legal journals and interoffice memorandums. But sitting at the very top of the pile was a small plain white envelope. The envelope lacked a return address. It bore no corporate logo or official firm stamp. My name and the firm's address were written across the front in blue ink. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and entirely unfamiliar. It was not the frantic scrawl of my father or the looping cursive of my mother. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the sealed flap. I pulled out a single sheet of lined paper, recognizing instantly that the past I thought I had buried was reaching out to me from an entirely unexpected direction. I unfolded the single sheet of lined notebook paper. The handwriting consisted of neat, blocky print, the kind favored by draftsmen and mechanics. The brief message carried no corporate letterhead or formal greeting. It read that he heard I made it to the big leagues. It offered a cup of coffee on him if I had the time. He specified Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon at Mike's Diner on Massachusetts Avenue. He signed the bottom with a single name, Thomas. I looked at the brass clock sitting on the corner of my mahogany desk. The analog hands indicated it was 3:15. I closed my laptop, placed the lined paper in my pocket, and retrieved my tailored wool coat from the wooden hanger near the door. I left the glass tower of the financial district and walked down to the subterranean parking garage. The drive across the Charles River felt like traversing a timeline. I had not returned to Cambridge since the afternoon of my graduation. The crisp November air carried a sharp, biting chill, stripping the last brown leaves from the ancient oak trees lining the avenue. I parked my car a few blocks away from the law school campus. The Gothic architecture of the academic buildings loomed against the gray sky, serving as a towering monument to the grueling years I spent proving my intellect to professors who demanded perfection. Mike's Diner occupied a narrow storefront tucked between a used bookstore and an independent dry cleaner. It operated as a relic of working-class Boston, a stubborn holdout against the encroaching tide of expensive coffee boutiques and upscale corporate bistros. A faded neon sign buzzed in the front window with a low electrical hum. I pushed open the heavy glass door. The scent of roasted coffee beans and fried bacon washed over me instantly, cutting through the sterile cedar-scented memory of my executive office. I scanned the narrow, crowded room. The diner featured a row of cracked red vinyl booths along the left wall and a long formica counter lined with chrome stools on the right. Thomas sat in the furthest booth near the back, facing the entrance to monitor the flow of foot traffic. He wore the same gray canvas work jacket I remembered from the library basement. A faded blue Union cap rested on the table next to a thick ceramic mug of steaming coffee. I walked down the central aisle. My sharp navy suit and polished leather heels stood out in stark contrast against the worn linoleum floor. I reached the back of the restaurant and slid into the booth across from him. Thomas looked at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He did not offer a formal handshake or a polite corporate greeting. He simply gave a single nod and noted that I looked like a lawyer who actually won her cases. I smiled. It was a genuine, unforced expression, a rarity in my highly calibrated daily routine. I told him I learned to secure my victories by making sure I always read the fine print. A waitress wearing a stained white apron walked over to our table. She filled a heavy mug with hot coffee and slid it across the table toward me. She placed a small metal pitcher of cream in the center and walked away without asking for a food order. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic. I asked Thomas how he knew where to find me, and how he knew I was succeeding in the commercial litigation department. He reached for a paper sugar packet, tore the top off with a quick motion, and poured the contents into his cup. He stirred the dark liquid slowly with a metal spoon. He explained that Jonathan Reed called him once a quarter. He said the managing partner liked to check in on the man who saved him from a crippling panic attack 2 decades ago. Thomas took a sip of his coffee. He set the mug down and told me Jonathan considered me the sharpest litigator he had hired in 10 years. He mentioned that the partners on the executive committee were already tracking my billable hours to prepare a future junior partner nomination. A profound, radiant warmth spread through my chest. For my entire life, I sought validation from people who shared my last name. I brought home perfect report cards and prestigious academic awards only to receive dismissive nods from parents who preferred to celebrate my brother's fabricated milestones. Now a night janitor and a ruthless corporate attorney were monitoring my career trajectory with genuine protective pride. I thanked him. I told him I would not be sitting in a corner office if he had not made that phone call from the courtyard. I stated that I owed him a debt I could never properly repay. Thomas shook his head. He pointed a calloused finger at my coffee cup. He told me I earned the seat in that town car myself. He said he merely opened the door, but I was the one who walked through it and refused to leave. We sat in a comfortable silence for several minutes. The ambient noise of the diner surrounded us. Plates clattered against the counter, and the grill cook called out orders in a low, rhythmic cadence. The grounded atmosphere provided a stark contrast to the hollow, performative environments of my past. I looked down at the dark reflection in my coffee. Despite the flawless legal victory, a lingering shadow rested over my conscience. I decided to speak the truth. I confessed that enforcing the boundary with my family carried a heavy, unexpected weight. I explained the details of the settlement agreement, the liquidation of the commercial properties, and the mandatory wage garnishments. I recounted the final Sunday morning in my apartment, the itemized invoice, and the sound of the deadbolt locking them out of my life forever. I looked up at Thomas. I admitted that the math was correct and the legal strategy was sound, but the quiet of my apartment sometimes felt isolating. I told him I occasionally wondered if I had pushed too hard, if I had destroyed the very foundation of my own history. Thomas did not interrupt my confession. He listened with the quiet, focused intensity of a man who had spent a lifetime observing human behavior from the periphery. He did not offer legal advice or toxic positivity. He offered a grounded piece of working-class wisdom. He told me I did not break my family. He stated that I just handed them the mirror they had been running from. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He said some people simply cannot handle the reflection. His words landed with undeniable precision. They cut through the lingering guilt and illuminated the core reality of the conflict. I did not force my parents to commit bank fraud. I did not force my brother to sign a predatory vendor contract. I did not compel them to skip my graduation. They built a fragile house of cards based on entitlement and deceit. I merely turned on the fan. Their inability to survive the truth was a testament to their own weakness, not a reflection of my cruelty. Thomas continued speaking. He explained his reasoning for picking up the flip phone on that crisp May afternoon. He said he had watched thousands of brilliant students pass through the law school library. He saw the heirs to vast fortunes and the children of prominent judges. He noted that most of them folded under the first sign of genuine adversity. He pointed at me. He recalled finding me on the concrete bench abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect me. He said I was crying, but I was still clutching the leather degree folio with both hands. I refused to drop what I had earned. He stated that specific action revealed my true character. He validated my worth not by my billing rate or my corporate title, but by my resilience in the face of profound rejection. A deep, resonant clarity settled over my mind. The archaic definition of family relies entirely on genetic coincidence. It demands unearned loyalty and enforces a hierarchy based on bloodlines. True family operates on a different metric entirely. True family consists of the people who recognize your value when you have nothing material to offer them. It is the mentor who challenges you to excel, the colleagues who respect your intellect, and the quiet observer who makes a single phone call to ensure your potential is not wasted on a sidewalk. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I slid the currency under the edge of my coffee saucer to cover the check and leave a generous tip for the waitress. I looked at Thomas and told him I finally understood. We slid out of the vinyl booth and walked toward the front door together. He pulled his faded blue union cap down over his gray hair. I adjusted the lapels of my wool coat. We stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cold November wind sweeping down Massachusetts Avenue. Thomas offered a firm, calloused handshake. He told me to keep reading the fine print and to never apologize for winning. He turned and walked down the street toward the transit station, blending into the crowd of evening commuters. I stood alone on the pavement. The street lights flickered on, casting a warm golden glow across the brick facades of Cambridge. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sharp, clean air. The heavy, lingering burden of my past vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of profound peace. I turned toward my car, ready to leave the campus behind, and return to the empire I was building with my own two hands. 1 year passed. The executive boardroom on the 44th floor of Reed & Associates overlooked the Boston Harbor. The autumn sun hung low over the water, casting a sharp golden hue across the polished expanse of the mahogany table. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, analyzing the final pages of a quarterly litigation report. I was 26 years old today. I sat surrounded by the senior partners of the firm. These men and women represented the highest echelon of the New England legal establishment. A year prior, I viewed them as intimidating titans who held the power to end my career with a single red pen. Now they were my peers. We spoke the same language of billable hours, risk assessment, and precise legal strategy. I earned my seat at this table by consistently demonstrating a ruthless adherence to facts and an unyielding work ethic. Jonathan Reed stood at the head of the boardroom. He addressed the executive committee, summarizing the fiscal year and highlighting the most lucrative victories. He brought up the commercial litigation settlement, the specific civil complaint that systematically dismantled my brother's shell company. He did not frame the victory as a domestic dispute or a personal family tragedy. He presented the outcome as a masterclass in aggressive discovery and flawless procedural execution. He noted the millions of dollars saved for our corporate client and the swift, undeniable liquidation of the defendant's assets. He closed his leather folio and placed it on the table. He looked down the length of the room and locked eyes with me. He announced to the executive committee that my performance over the past 12 months exceeded every metric established for a junior associate. He stated that the firm operated on a strict, unbending meritocracy. He noted that I possessed a distinct ability to locate the structural vulnerabilities hidden deep within complex commercial contracts. He formally proposed placing my name on the expedited track for junior partner. A murmur of genuine approval rippled through the room. Achieving a partnership track at 26 years old was an unprecedented anomaly in a traditional firm. It required unanimous consent from the governing board. The senior partners raised their hands to cast their votes. The decision was unanimous. I maintained my composure, offering a measured nod of gratitude to the room, but a profound, radiant heat bloomed in my chest. The committee members adjourned a few minutes later, filing out of the glass doors and returning to their respective corners of the skyscraper. Jonathan Reed remained in the room. He walked over to a crystal decanter resting on a side credenza. He poured a measure of single malt scotch into 2 heavy glass tumblers. The amber liquid caught the fading sunlight. He picked up the glasses, walked the length of the table, and handed one to me. He did not offer a patronizing speech. He did not toast to luck or good fortune. He raised his glass and acknowledged the hard, undeniable work it took to secure my position. We drank in silence. The liquid burned a warm, steady path down my throat, cementing the symbolic shift from subordinate to peer. I looked at the man standing across from me. He represented the new foundation I had built. My chosen family did not share my genetic code. My chosen family consisted of mentors who challenged my intellect, colleagues who respected my professional boundaries, and a working-class janitor who recognized my resilience. They demanded excellence, and they rewarded it with genuine loyalty. They did not ask me to shrink myself to protect their fragile egos. They handed me a sword and taught me how to swing it. A short vibration interrupted the quiet atmosphere. My cell phone rested face up on the mahogany table, the screen illuminated, displaying a new text message notification. I set my glass down on a coaster and picked up the device. The message was from my mother. The text contained a brief generic wish for a pleasant birthday. It lacked warmth. It lacked any inquiry about my life, my career progression, or my well-being. It was an obligatory gesture sent by a woman sitting in a cramped, downsized condominium. A woman who still could not comprehend the reality of her own choices. A year ago, that digital silence would have carved a hollow ache in my chest. I would have spent hours analyzing her punctuation, searching the empty spaces for hidden affection. Today, the words held zero currency. I did not feel a surge of anger. I did not feel the urge to remind her of the consequences she earned. I felt nothing at all. I did not type a response. I dragged my thumb across the screen, archived the message thread, and slipped the phone into the pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I left the financial district an hour later. The evening air carried a crisp, familiar chill. I chose not to hail a taxi or call for a private car. I wanted to walk through the city streets. I crossed the bridge into Cambridge, navigating the brick sidewalks and wrought iron fences that defined the academic heart of Massachusetts. The route took me directly past the law school campus. I slowed my pace as the grand stone architecture of Langdale Hall came into view. The courtyard was empty, quiet under the glow of the antique street lamps. I stopped walking. I looked at the concrete bench stationed near the heavy oak doors. It was the exact same spot where I sat 1 year ago, wearing a velvet valedictorian gown, holding a leather folio, and crying over a phone call. I stared at the rough gray surface. I visualized the terrified, abandoned girl who thought her life was over because her family refused to offer her a seat at their table. I did not feel sorrow for that girl. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. Their abandonment was the catalyst for my elevation. Their refusal to support me forced me to forge my own armor. If they had shown up to my graduation, if they had played the role of a supportive, loving family, I would have spent the rest of my life suffocating under their endless demands. I would have drained my own potential to keep them comfortable. Instead, they left me in the cold. They forced me to realize that my survival depended entirely on my own intellect. They taught me the most valuable lesson of my life by showing me exactly who they were. I turned away from the bench and faced the glowing streetlights of the city. I was 26 years old. I held a lucrative career, an unyielding reputation, and a life built on solid stone. I am speaking to you now, to anyone who has ever sat on a bench feeling like they were not enough for the people they loved. Listen to me very carefully. Your worth is not defined by the people who leave you behind. It is defined by the empire you build with the stones they threw.
There is a specific kind of tragedy that unfolds behind the manicured lawns, wrought iron gates, and heavy oak doors of the American suburbs. It rarely arrives with the wail of sirens or the crash of shattered glass. Instead, it creeps in quietly, dressed impeccably in the guise of perfection. The story of Adelaide Williams and the collapse of her family's dynasty is far more than a chilling account of legal retribution or corporate maneuvering. Stripped to its core, it is a profound mirror held up to the quiet agonies born from our modern obsession with status, the relentless pursuit of an illusion, and the devastating generational cost of conditional love. In American culture, where individualism, material wealth, and professional titles often dictate a family's perceived value, the pressure to produce a traditionally successful child can be blinding. We are conditioned to want the entrepreneurs on the sprawling estate, the imported cars gleaming in the driveway. This desperate pursuit of the picturesque American dream often strips parents of their most vital and necessary tool, wisdom. Adelaide's parents lacked the fundamental wisdom to see the profound weakness hiding behind their son Bradley's tailored linen shirts and fabricated executive titles. They were utterly mesmerized by the loud, flashy performance of success, completely confusing their son's arrogant entitlement with actual competence. At the same time, they looked at Adelaide's quiet, grueling dedication, her late nights in the law library, her unassuming resilience, her brilliant mind, and mistook her lack of theatricality for inferiority. Wisdom in parenting requires tearing down the altar of our own egos. It demands that we stop projecting our unfulfilled social anxieties onto our children. True emotional clarity is accepting that a child's brilliance might not look like the loud, celebrated victory we envisioned, but rather a quiet, unyielding flame that burns in the background. When parents shed the heavy, suffocating burden of social expectations and choose to see the reality of who their children actually are, they free not only their sons and daughters but themselves. However, seeing clearly is only half the equation. Acting with moral integrity is the other. In the traditional family structure, we often confuse love with protection and protection with enabling. The total downfall of the Williams family was rooted in a catastrophic moral failure, the abandonment of fundamental fairness. To protect their golden boy, Adelaide's parents did not just look the other way when he stumbled. They actively participated in a lie. They liquidated their retirement falsified loan documents and drained their legacy to sustain a fiction. True love, the kind that actually sustains a family and builds resilient adults, must be paired with absolute clarity and moral courage. Shielding a child from the consequences of their own actions is not an act of devotion, it is an act of sabotage. By using their wealth and deceit to pave over every pothole in Bradley's path, they robbed him of the most fundamental human lessons: how to fall, how to feel the sting of failure, and how to stand back up on his own 2 feet. They pushed him into an abyss, padded with their own money, ensuring that when the money ran out, he would have no survival skills left. Fairness in parenting means allowing your children to face the natural consequences of their choices. Sometimes the most profound and painful act of parental love is taking a step back, refusing to write the check, and letting the chips fall exactly where they may. Changing a child's path is difficult, but changing oneself requires the kind of willpower few are willing to summon. The ultimate collapse of Adelaide's parents was not just a financial bankruptcy, it was a bankruptcy of courage. They lacked the willpower to look at their dwindling bank accounts, their mounting lies, and admit, "We are failing, we were wrong." Instead, they used the hollow shell of their social standing to hide their profound internal weakness. It takes immense grit for a parent to face their own shame, to stop the bleeding before it is too late, and to respect the boundaries their children draw. When Adelaide finally set a rigid, immovable boundary, when she handed them the itemized bill for their own negligence, her parents attacked her with hypocritical moral pressure. They weaponized the concept of family to demand her submission. But a courageous parent understands that when children grow into adulthood, they are no longer possessions to be managed or investments to draw dividends from. They are companions on a parallel journey. Respecting a child's independence, honoring their boundaries, and acknowledging their right to walk away is the only way a parent can truly free themselves from the suffocating weight of control. The peace we desperately seek within our homes does not reside in massive stock portfolios, country club memberships, or the envious whispers of our neighbors. It resides in the quiet, unclouded conscience of the parents themselves. When we step back to correct our own flaws, when we stop comparing our children to the ghosts of our expectations, true wisdom takes root. Only then can we guide them with a love grounded in honesty, emotional awareness, and deep, abiding respect. If you found yourself reflecting on your own family dynamics through this narrative, or if you believe in the power of stories that champion quiet dignity and hard-earned boundaries, take a moment to subscribe to Orange Vengeance. We explore the complexities of human relationships, the consequences of our choices, and the ultimate triumph of truth every single week. Join our community and let us know your thoughts in the comments. We spend decades building houses out of expectations, meticulously arranging the bricks of our legacy, so the world might look at us and see perfection. But houses built on illusions are incredibly fragile. Eventually a storm will come, a storm shaped like a breached contract, an unavoidable consequence, or a daughter sitting alone on a concrete bench. And when the walls finally crack and the cold wind blows through the rooms we tried so hard to control, we are left standing in the debris, forced to look at what remains. The question is not whether the storm will arrive, but whether when the dust finally settles, you will be able to live with the reflection staring back at you from the broken glass.